Welcome everybody. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this keynote lecture. My name's Anna Muggeridge. I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Worcester and a visiting research fellow here at the Mile End Institute. And it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Khursheed Wadia, who is Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Her research lies at the intersection of gender, ethnicity and politics in Europe, with a focus on Britain and France. It covers the field of political participation and policy, with a focus on why and how young people engage with political and civic institutions and processes. She is an editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender. She is the co-author of landmark works including Women and Politics in France, Refugee Women in Britain and France, the Securitization of Migration in the EU, and Muslim Women and Power, Political and Civic Engagement in Western Europe, which won the Political Studies Association Prize for the Best Book in Political Science in 2018. And she'll be speaking to us today on Becoming Muslim Women, Becoming Political. So, Khursheed, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Lindsay, Tom, Farah, Ruth, Anna for inviting me. It's really great to be here, and I've really enjoyed the conference so far. I have to say that when I received the invitation to this conference to talk about Muslim women in politics, I didn't clock the time frame of 1945 to 1997, which was mentioned in the title. And that's mainly because Muslim women in Britain weren't spoken about much, if at all, until the 2000s. The study of Muslim women is recent, the category Muslim women is recent, and it's emerged and has been established in the 2000s in the post-9/11 period. Before that, women whose family origins were in Muslim-majority countries were spoken about in terms of their ethnicity or nationality. So in public and political discourses, this population of women was spoken of as Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Yemeni and so on. And they were counted as part of the aggregate category Black and minority ethnic or BME women. Before considering the political engagement of Muslim women in Britain in the 2000s, it's important and necessary, I think, to rewind to the last 30 years of the 20th century. To locate their social and political genealogies, to ask who were Muslim women then, were they politically engaged, if they were, how and to what end. And I'll be referring to women from Muslim majority countries which were British ex-colonies, because that's where the most significant flows of Muslim family migration stemmed. So I'll be talking about women from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, which constituted almost 2/3 of Muslims in Britain by 2001. I'll then go on to talk about the emergence of Muslim women as a category, asking how it is characterized externally and how those to whom it refers respond to this external characterization. And I consider the political engagement of Muslim women saying something about the way in which they engage politically before making some connections between the context and characteristics of their engagement with that of the previous generation. So what I'm presenting here today is both a distillation and a synthesis of some of the research that I've done over a number of years. So Pakistani and Bangladeshi women only began to form a significant population in Britain from the early 70s, when Pakistani men came to work in Britain in the 50s and 60s, and then they sent for their wives and children. This happened because post-war economic growth came to an end, unemployment was rising, and so the British government of the time placed severe curbs on immigration in 1971 to stop labour immigration from the new Commonwealth countries and to stop free movement between Britain and the South Asian subcontinent. Bangladeshi women also arrived from the early 1970s with husbands, with other family members. And a large part of that population was fleeing a brutal war of independence in 1971 and the political turmoil that followed that war over the next few years in their country. Of course, there were South Asian women who had settled in Britain long before these family migrations. For the most part, they tended to be middle-class women who had come to Britain as students, who had stayed over, or they had immigrated with husbands who had professions, or some of them practiced a profession in their own right. However, the majority of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women found themselves among the most economically and socially disadvantaged communities in Britain. They faced hostility and resentment, and they were the target of racism and discrimination. And women and children particularly were targets of racist attitudes and behaviors in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, in schools. And too often these women were characterized as hopeless and as unwilling or unable to participate in the job market. And in other areas of public life. This is an inaccurate characterization. While it's well documented in nationally representative surveys that Pakistani and Bangladeshi women had and continue to have low levels of economic activity and high levels of unemployment, the headline figures don't tell you the full picture. For example, these women were treated in an undifferentiated way without reference to class, age, or family status, which accounted for significant variations in economic activity and in employment rates. And the studies missed out significant numbers of women who worked in unregistered businesses or in their own homes, for example, serving the garment industry or small-scale food producers in their localities in towns like Luton, Oldham, in the east of London, or in Birmingham. And also, the survey figures couldn't explain the discrimination which prevented women of colour who wanted to and who often desperately needed to work from getting jobs, even at the bottom end of the labour market. So it's accurate to say that not only did Pakistani and Bangladeshi women undertake paid work, but they also struggled for better wages and working conditions, or they supported those who did. And in doing so, many of them were drawn into local trade union and local activist networks from the mid-1970s and into the 1980s and 1990s. And this is an important point because one of the most established findings in research on political engagement is that there is a positive relation between being in work, especially a formally organized workplace, and being politically active. So this is a good point at which to turn to the political activism of women from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities during that period and ask what were the issues that they became involved with and how did they express this involvement. The main spaces in which the women were present were civil society organizations, both local and national, although more local than national, and in campaigns over specific issues. As far as the earliest formally constituted organizations were concerned, there were really very few which convened women only, and those had strong links with political movements in Pakistan and Bangladesh. So in their early years, these organizations, and you really could count them on one hand, these women's organizations, they focused entirely on country of origin politics. So for example, the All Pakistan Women's Association, which was run by middle-class Pakistani women, but drew support also from working-class families, organized political meetings and fundraisers to support Pakistan's alliance building activities in this country and in other European countries as well. Other organizations such as the Bangladesh Women's Association of the UK organized mainly in support of the Bangladesh Liberation War. They raised awareness among British and European politicians, and again, they did a lot of fundraising for the liberation effort. And the Bangladesh Women's Association, which had kind of offshoots in various parts of the UK where there were Bangladeshi communities, got large numbers of women involved in militant actions, which included demonstrations and hunger strikes, but also in quieter forms, such as petitioning. And Ramina Toki, who's written a history of Bangladeshi women's organizations, reports from the work that she's done that hundreds of ordinary Bangladeshi women in Britain were mobilized and played a vital part in their country of origin's liberation. However, from the mid-70s, these organizations, which had concentrated on country of origin politics, started to diversify their activities, and they started to include advocacy for the rights of newly arrived women migrants in the UK, and they provided a cultural bridge between communities settled in Britain and their country of origin. And the 70s and the 80s also saw an increase in the number of ethnic minority organizations and campaigns which fought against racism and discrimination and for social justice. And ordinary Pakistani and Bangladeshi women were also drawn into these mixed organizations and campaigns, very often persuaded by relatives or friends or co-workers to join in the actions. Most of these women were in their early 20s. Some of them were even in their late teens. They'd got married and they come here in their late teens. So they were recently arrived in Britain. They'd left extended family networks back home. They were reassessing their sense of self. They were dreaming different lives for their children, but they were also feeling quite isolated at the same time. And so it was very tempting for them to get, despite any barriers that they encountered in the home, it was very tempting for them to get involved in community actions, which were organized by a plethora of organizations, but one of those networks of organizations was the Asian Youth Movement, which formed in the mid-1970s. And the Asian Youth Movement groups were springing up in London, Manchester, Bradford, and other areas where there were large South Asian populations. And the Asian youth movements campaigned on issues of immigration, police repression, institutional racism, and women were particularly active in their campaigns against Home Office refusal to allow divorced and separated women to remain in Britain because their immigration status depended on them being married, and also campaigned against Home Office refusal of children born overseas to be reunited with their parents in this country. And just to give you one example, a high-profile campaign that lasted for many years was that of Anwar Ditta, a woman of Pakistani heritage. But she was born in Britain, she held British citizenship, but when she was a teenager, she was sent back to Pakistan. And while she was there, she got married, she had 3 children, but then decided to come back to Britain. And when she came back to Britain, she applied for her children to join her, but was refused because they were born overseas. And the Home Office cast doubt on Ditta's claim that they were her kids, despite her providing documentary evidence and undergoing virginity testing by immigration officers. So after a campaign which lasted between 1975 and 1982, she did actually win her case. And the importance of this case, and the reason why I'm highlighting it, is that it did bring in, it drew in, hundreds of women into the campaign. It gave these women confidence and courage to claim their rights, to appeal against unjust Home Office decisions and so on. And for Ditta, one of the greatest satisfactions, she said, was to have brought so many women together, and as she saw it, to have empowered them to pursue their own claims. So apart from that, women also fought in campaigns against poor housing and for the housing rights of South Asian tenants. Some worked for progressive housing associations on a paid or a voluntary basis, and acted as a link between local authorities and tenants, and developed services aimed at supporting tenants to navigate British society. Others worked in a network of Asian resource centers, which were established in the 1970s to support new South Asian migrants deal with public institutions and to overcome barriers that were created by local bureaucracies, but also racist attitudes and discriminatory practices. And also women who were escaping abusive relationships were supported by these Asian resource centers. So these are examples of the political activism of Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. And while I've highlighted some prominent organizations and campaigns, there were lots more in areas with large South Asian populations, but their history remains concealed even today, and there are several reasons why. Many of the campaigns involving the women naturally ended once a problem was resolved, but their history wasn't recorded, it wasn't archived. And the same thing with organizations that were mobilizing Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. They were not fixed. They broke up, they were reborn, some of them disappeared, all down to poor resources and dependence on volunteers who couldn't give their time without being remunerated forever. Also, the organizations couldn't rely on durable alliances and pooling resources because of their heterogeneity. Some were anti-racist, anti-sexist, and overtly political. Others were more cultural, and yet others became drawn into service provision. But also because mainstream organizations, feminist organizations, women's movement organizations didn't see a benefit in linking with them. So this fragmentation plus the exclusion from white mainstream third sector and activist networks didn't promote longevity and didn't allow for a recording of the activities of these organizations and campaigns. I should point out that this period also saw an important level of intellectual production by feminists of color, but with very few exceptions, these didn't cover the stories of ordinary women on picket lines, on pension strikes, on anti-poverty protests, and so on. Three more points are worth noting about this period. Well, there's a lot more than three, but I'm kind of trying to distill it down. Firstly, Bangladeshi and Pakistani women mostly organized politically within mixed male-dominated campaigns and organizations. And in part, this continued the legacy of women's activism alongside men during anti-colonial struggles in South Asia, which had recognized the goal of women's equality in principle, but ranked it far below that of national independence. But organizational mixity was also a way of showing unity against racism and discrimination, and of preventing South Asian women from washing, as they called it, washing dirty laundry in public by talking about sexism and misogyny in their own communities. And this is an accusation that was leveled against black feminist organizations in particular in the 1980s, Southall Black Sisters, for instance, was accused of that over and over again as they defended women from those kind of, from sexism and misogyny within their own communities. The second point is that Bangladeshi and Pakistani women's grassroots activism didn't intersect with white feminist activism. By and large, women of color were seen by white feminism as a problem to be solved. In the case of Black, Caribbean, and African women, the problem was their alienation from white feminism. But in the case of South Asian women, it was because of what was seen as their backward cultural practices. And then among women of color, both feminists and those who didn't care for this white labeling as they saw it, white feminism was seen to address the concerns and aspirations of middle-class white feminists, of middle-class white women, and to consider sexism and misogyny as the only axis of women's oppression universally. They felt that the failure to factor in intersecting oppressions based on race, faith, class, which structured the post-colonial experiences of women of color, they felt that the failure to do that led to an undermining of their struggles. And then the third point is that women activists were concerned with a range of issues which at best were only peripheral to the agendas of political parties. So it was very, very difficult for women in that period to build platforms from which to launch into electoral politics. And even where women belonged to British political parties, even where they had political skills and know-how, it was impossible for them to force open the doors, which were guarded first of all by men in their communities and then by white party officials, and force down these doors which would lead to recognition within parties and to eventually to candidate selection processes. And we heard a lot of good stuff from Farah yesterday about that in her example of the Labour Party in particular. So during this period, barely any South Asian women made it to electoral office. A few made it to councilorships. In the 1980s, you had Zabanu Gifford becoming a councillor in Harrow, Najma Hafiz becoming a councillor in Birmingham, but really they were exceptions. And no Asian woman would, South Asian woman would enter parliament until 2010, with 23 years after Diane Abbott's historical win. So this important history really underpins that of Muslim women's political engagement in the 2000s, to which I will turn to now. So questions about Muslims and Islam had emerged before the 2000s. Things had been rumbling before then. For example, at the time of the Rushdie affair, which kind of happened from 1988 onwards, the question of Islam had come up. Or when the first French headscarf controversy of 1989 broke out, there was a lot of discussion about that. But these events were not counted as a systematic internal threat to the British state. Nor was the term Muslim used as a social category, and nor was it used as an all-pervasive othering of people. But this changed after 9/11, but also if you're thinking about the British context, in 2001 you'd also had the Northern riots in the towns of Oldham and Bradford and places like that, Burnley, etc. So so this changed in the 2000s, and after 9/11 in particular, Muslim became a category which held certain characteristics and behaviors which were deemed harmful to Western society and which were seen as being irreconcilable with Western values. And this became circulated as some kind of common sense knowledge in public and political discourses. And eventually such common sense knowledge finds its way into policy making, whether it's about hijab bans or de-radicalization programs or stripping people of their citizenship. And also from 2001, Muslims could be categorized numerically as the census of that year in England and Wales included a religion question for the first time. So that gives you some idea, a very quick idea of how this category of Muslim was characterized. This externally applied identity and these characteristics, when applied to Muslim women, shouted out traditional, backward, compliant, and all of those kind of images. And all of those implied certain ways of behaving. And Muslim women were, in public and political discourses, often reduced to the singular image of the veil, symbol of a backward faith. And burdened by the hijab and religion, Muslim women came to be seen as oppressed by violent, misogynistic brown men. They were compliant, they were enslaved by family and domesticity. And so these discourses fed into, in the post 9/11 period, into the idea that Muslim women had to be saved from Muslim men and from oppressive Islam. And in part, this justified the war on terror and the actions which accompanied the war on terror, the Afghanistan invasion, the Iraq war, and so on. Moving a bit later into the 2000s, and especially after the London bombings of 7/7, for this country, Muslim women were also seen to be a group that had to be empowered as a means of controlling the men in that community. This wasn't just something that was unique to Britain, it was happening in other countries as well. It took different forms. But this notion was at the basis of the first prevention of violent extremism or PREVENT program in Britain. But then even later, when Muslim women apparently failed to show gratitude for being saved and empowered, another type of Muslim woman was revealed. This was the mother who didn't stop her son from becoming a terrorist. This was the jihadi bride who shunned Western freedoms to go off and join Islamic State. This was the lyrical terrorist who dreamed of beheadings. It was the woman who actually tried to stab and kill a Labour MP. So the events of 9/11 and this very messed up construction of Muslim women provided an impetus for Muslim women to either resist and engage politically or for their alienation and disconnection from British society. And it's the political engagement which is of interest here. So, as Muslim communities came under heavy surveillance and policing after 9/11, women were compelled to play roles previously unfamiliar to them. In so many cases, wives, mothers, sisters of men who were imprisoned or suspected of terrorism took on male family responsibilities. Many also helped to establish and to support campaigns for justice and for the release of male relatives and friends. Some women were directly subjected to surveillance, questioning, and arrest by the police. And in this context, Muslim women became politicized quite quickly. So most of the women that were being politicized were younger women. They were the daughters, they were the granddaughters of women who had settled in Britain in the 1970s, or they were women who had arrived as part of more recent migration, refugee migrations in the 1990s from Africa and the Middle East. And this younger generation has had to tread an uneasy path between Western ideals of modernity and values attached to their ethnic and religious cultures. And it's a positioning that non-Muslims find very difficult to grasp, and sometimes it's not even understood by their own mothers and grandmothers who didn't feel caught between cultures, but were certain of their Pakistani or Bangladeshi identity and who had settled in Britain for better or worse. So, while Muslim women became politicized after the 9/11 events, not all of them were committed and active to the same extent. However, in research, in empirical research that I've done with colleagues, we found that the majority of Muslim women had, if you're taking a baseline, had voted in either general or local elections. Other than voting, a proportion of them had also experienced other forms of political activism, which may best be summarized by considering three types of activists, which I'm calling stay-home activists, civic activists, and intense political activists. So if we just say, I'll just say something brief about each of these types. So stay-home political activists, these were women who had taken little interest in politics. Well, they said they'd taken little interest in politics before 9/11. They had voted, but not always committedly, not always consistently, and for them, politics represented a remote, a faraway world of parties, parliaments, and what a lot of them were calling high-up issues. And only a few well-connected women could enter this world, as far as they could tell. After 9/11, they experienced a deep and unshifting unease about their presence in Britain, where most of them were born and brought up. And the 9/11 and later the London 7/7 bombings made them hyper-visible, and their feelings of exposure and vulnerability were more acute if they were wearers of the hijab. So they felt, and this is something that came out in so many testimonies, that when they were out shopping or when they were dropping their children off to school or they were walking around in their neighborhoods, they felt that they were on trial. They felt that they were being scrutinized. They had to explain to people they had known over years that they were not terrorist sympathizers, and they had to teach their children what to say at school if asked about the events of 9/11 or 7/7. And many women directly experienced hate crime for the first time. They had experienced the everyday microaggressions of racism, but had somehow felt protected from the worst effects of racism within their close-knit families and communities. And for many of them, racist hate crime had happened to others, but now it was happening to them or to someone they knew, and almost on a weekly basis. So in this scenario, Muslim women felt that they couldn't stand by and do nothing. Many of them felt obliged to learn about British politics. We're still talking about the stay-home category here. In order to make sense of events, public reactions, and to counter hostility. So they started to follow news and current affairs closely, gaining enough confidence to discuss political events and issues with friends and family, and then even in online forums. Among stay-home political activists, political activity increased from, say, just wearing a badge about, freedom for Palestine, and, clicking on their keyboards to donate to a social action campaign or to sign and share petitions, to the more active end, such as taking voting seriously, joining voter registration campaigns online, and so on, or contacting their local councillor or politician. And stay-home activism has also led to an explosion of blogging in which politicized gender, race, and faith identities are being expressed, even now, quite a lot. And if you just do a search of Muslim blog sites, you will come across a heck of a lot of them based either in the UK or abroad, and there's a lot of interaction going on there. So stay-home political activists found it easier to do politics via social media, not on the streets. But over time, a number of them said that they'd been drawn into action outside the home because of an increasing need to become part of a real-life activist community. So in a way, these aren't watertight categories. Most stay-home activists were students and women not in work. Muslim women also fall into the category of civic activists. And the majority of civic activists are involved as volunteers or in paid work in ethnic minority. Prior to 9/11, that is, they were involved as volunteers or were in paid work in ethnic minority or migrant community organizations, or they worked for in the public or third sector, most commonly in the NHS, in local government, in Muslim and migrant charities. And the issues which drew them into these structures most commonly included things like child poverty, and education, domestic violence, racism, immigration. And despite this activism, they saw themselves as not political. And they said they only wanted to provide good role models for young Muslims and counter negative stereotypes of women from Muslim and minority communities. And what the post-9/11 period did was it saw an intensification of their civic engagement and a shift towards political actions that previously they would not have contemplated. So, for instance, it made a lot of them rethink their attitude to demonstrations and political rallies. Lots of them went on demonstrations against the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. They started to go to protests on the repression of Palestinians and so on. Civic activists were also highly committed voters, and by virtue of their activism and over issues of poverty, homelessness, and so on, they did come into contact with political institutions, with political actors, and they acted politically contrary to the rejection of this label by them. So that's the kind of category we saw as civic activists. If I move on to intense political activists, in this category are women who gained public visibility since the events of 9/11. And most of the women in this category had been politically very interested or active before 9/11, either in student politics or in a local party organization or in social movement politics. And they were a mix of students, professionals in employment, or mums at home who had a university education but who had kids they wanted to stay home for. And their activism developed due to family history of being involved in politics, or getting into student politics at university, or because they'd had personal experiences which made them think about making things better, whether those were racist attacks or domestic violence or something else. But none of them had gained visibility publicly before 2001. And the trajectory of some of these women is really quite remarkable, and their backstories are really fascinating. But there's little time over here, and so saying something about their beginning and endpoints, and they're not necessarily endpoints, but I'm doing that for convenience, will have to do for us today. So an example would be the student who became an NUS activist, an officer, then went on to help run an MP's constituency office, and then ended up as a local councillor, as she is today. Another one is an NHS professional who went from being very interested in politics and a committed voter to joining and then becoming a leader of the anti-war movement, anti-Afghanistan-Iraq war movement, went on to then become a local councillor, went on to stand for election in the 2010 general election, before eventually returning to her NHS job. And there are numerous such stories, and it's worth pointing out that while the person in the second example failed to get elected, 3 other women, Muslim women that year, did get elected as MPs. And since then, another 7 have joined them. But this summary really brushes the surface of Muslim women's rich and varied political experiences in the 2000s. And the issues which have touched them are not far off those that touched their mums and their grandmums. So social and economic disadvantage faced by their families and communities, gendered and Islamophobic racism, immigration, but something that their mums and grandmothers hadn't experienced was, and that they had to contend with, was dealing with the label of being from a community that had produced terrorists. And they had to deal with that. They had to deal with the anti-terrorism legislation, which has led to what Paddy Hilliard referred to as the suspectification of entire communities. Hilliard was talking about the Irish, but in this case, it's Muslims in Britain. So to finish, what can we say about Muslim women's political engagement? What connections can be made between activists in the 2000s and their mothers' and grandmothers' generations? And again, I'll just end up with a few points which don't cover everything that could be said. First of all, is that contexts determine how different generations of women were named and perceived, the issues which concerned them and how they organized. So while Pakistani and Bangladeshi women organized mostly with men in mixed spaces, Muslim women in the 2000s have claimed greater autonomy of organization. And for example, at the height of the first Prevent program, which made funding available for Muslim women because the idea was to empower them, around 90 new women's groups and organizations, both local and national, received empowerment funding or Prevent funding, and they did not, the organizations that they set up did not involve men. However, as I've said, many of the issues that concern their mothers and grandmothers persist, and activists today do struggle against social and economic disadvantage in their communities, against unjust immigration, detention, deportation policies and practices, against violence against women, and so on. But they're doing this while they're also fighting to freely practice their faith, which is cast as alien and dangerous to British values, to Western values, and they're fighting against the suspectification, the surveillance, the monitoring of their communities at the same time. Second, just as the stories of their mothers and grandmothers' activism went unrecorded and unarchived and are largely lost to the history of the women's movement generally in Britain, there is a danger that this will be the same for Muslim women's autonomous organizations and political activism today, because again, organizations and groups have been forming, they've been reforming, they've disappeared due to lack of resources, due to the continuing difficulty of being accepted by mainstream women's organizations as good political allies. And there are, of course, exceptions to this. But this means that but this kind of not being accepted as good allies also means that they are limited to speaking and acting around certain issues that are seen to be legitimately within their remit. But lots of women and within organizations and outside of organizations are interested in political issues beyond what they're supposed to be talking about, but they're not seen as credible spokespersons, for example, on environmentalism or LGBT issues, and so on. And then the final point that I just want to make is that Muslim women's political engagement may be considered as one way of resisting the stereotypes that have been externally imposed on the category Muslim women as constructed in the post-9/11 period. And as so many women say, they engage politically first and foremost because they want a better society, but also because their political engagement provides a good model to younger generations of Muslims and shows majority society that they too live beyond the home and they act in public arenas as agents of social and political change. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Khursheed, for a really brilliant, thought-provoking paper there. Can I open up to the floor for any questions you might have? I think we've got... Could you sit down? Oh, yes, of course, we do. Yes, that is allowed, sorry.
Sorry.
And we have a question over there when everyone is ready.
Hiya, my name's Ambia. I just wanted to say thank you for that. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. This is kind of the first time I'm hearing about kind of this shedding. I'm of Bangladeshi descent as well. A lot of the stories that you've said have touched because these are stories I've heard from my mother, from my grandmother. So I just wanted to thank you for that. Two of the kind of questions I had, the first one being kind of, you mentioned the Southall Black Sisters movement that they had. I've seen articles about it and the idea of political blackness and the question of kind of modern political blackness and how does that apply to kind of this era you were talking about. I don't know how much work you've done around that, but do you think that here, in the situation of the Southall Black Sisters, of course, these were kind of under the banner of loads of different minority women coming together to kind of fight for a collective minority group. Why do you think at this point that, before this you were talking about the country of origins work and how usually South Asian women did tend to just kind of stick to like Bangladeshi movements or Pakistani movements. Why do you think this situation is a bit more unique in terms of the Southall Black women's movement? And do you think it's more to do with minorities coming together in order to work against kind of this white feminism you were talking about, or another question of kind of political blackness? And my second question was kind of around the political engagement of today and the political activism that you see today. Of course, you talked about kind of post 9/11 and how a lot of the at-home activism that used to be before became more politically aware because of kind of the microaggressions that they were facing. The recent days you see the kind of British Muslims citizenship reduced to second-class citizens, a report done by a think tank about how the removal of citizenship is so easy for Muslim groups, in the case of Shamima Begum as a result. Do you think these kind of encourage negative forms of political engagement, as though Muslim women in particular, are becoming more political out of going against these ideas rather than out of kind of an origin of wanting to do political activism for good rather than having to continuously defend their stand? A lot of things like, as we've seen, it was loads of commentaries by members of parliament. Boris Johnson has his comments about like kind of hijabs and the wearing of it. And these are members who are supposed to be representing us in parliament. So do you think that a lot of these are, inspired by negative or positive form of engagement, political engagement. I don't know if that's that clear, but yeah, thank you again.
Okay, thanks very much for that, for your questions. There's a lot of stuff in there, and I'm not quite sure how I'll kind of find my way into answering all of it. In terms of, you asked about organizations which brought women together in the 30 years of the last century, if you like. And the point to be made is that there was a mosaic, if you like, of organizations. They were not all the same. They were not ideologically the same. So you had organizations like the All Pakistan Women's Organization. That was one of the oldest women's organizations in this country. And it was predominantly middle class, politically liberal, in terms of the political spectrum, liberal, at the most social democrat. And so the way in which they operated, the messages they wanted to send out to their audiences was very different to organizations like South All Black Sisters, which emerged on the feminist side of the black, the term was Black Women's Movement because that was a decision that the women made at that time in terms of how they wanted to call themselves and how they saw themselves politically. So there were differences in the organizations, and I don't know if that helps you. The Bangladeshi Women's Organization was very different. It was born out of fighting for the liberation of Bangladesh. So that organization was very clearly social democratic. So it's really difficult to. I'm not quite sure what you were saying. There were organizations like South All Black Sisters which called themselves black, which saw black as a political identity. But then there were other organizations, like the ones I've just mentioned, which they were different. And, in the same way as majority society organizations are so different with different ideologies and different goals and stuff, the same thing was true of organizations that operated within minority communities or for minority communities. Does that help?
Thank you, wonderful. Is there any more questions from the floor? Farah at the back.
Thank you, Khursheed. That was so insightful and such a nice, I learned so much about Muslim women's activism outside of political parties, which I hadn't really thought about before, so thank you so much. I'm really interested in also this idea of political blackness and then the identity sort of shifting towards Muslim women seeing themselves as more Muslim. And I was wondering if you have an inkling whether you think that identity is here to stay, or if there's another thing coming that Muslim women will start to identify as. And I'm particularly interested in whether South Asian women coming together would be a more useful mechanisms for change, because there is so much similarity between the experiences of women from the Indian subcontinent, despite what country their families were originally from. Also a question about the Salman Rushdie affair, and looking back, I'm really struck by how male it feels when you look at footage and you look at, who was saying what when. Everybody's a man. And I'm just wondering whether any of the women that you spoke about how they felt during that period, whether they supported what was going on, or whether they, were quietly not so agitated at home. And one last question. You mentioned about the saving brown women from brown men as part of the justification for the war in Afghanistan. And what really struck me is during the recent pullout from Afghanistan is that nobody really seemed to care anymore about what happens to brown women in Afghanistan, and girls in Afghanistan still aren't allowed to go to school. So I was just wondering whether you feel like I could probably guess your answer to this, but was it just a PR thing? Was it just a way to get support? Or did people care about Muslim women in Afghanistan and now they don't anymore? So sorry, 3 questions.
Okay, I should have brought my notebook with me.
I can,
I'll try and remember
identity, Rushdie, Afghanistan.
Okay. So I think what you asked was that is the kind of black as a political identity which organizations and women, black feminist organizations adopted in the 70s, 80s, started to fizzle out in the 90s and then kind of disappeared apart from small, tiny pockets. Whether that is an identity around which you can organize again. Is that what you said? Sorry.
So this might be really oversimplifying it, but I feel like it went from political blackness with a capital B to Muslim women identifying as Muslim. And I'm wondering whether you think the Muslim women identity is here to stay, or whether you think it will morph yet again, and could South Asian be a identity instead that replaces Muslim?
Okay, I mean, the presentation was like a real broad brush, and so it wasn't easy to capture details. But in a way, it didn't go from political blackness to Muslim women, because there was a whole period in between where it went from political blackness to after 1979 and the Tory government came in, and then after the riots in Liverpool and places and Birmingham and places like that, where a certain amount of funding became available through what was Section 11. It was called Section 11 funding, that was directed towards minority communities, ethnic minority communities. And in a way, that funding prepared the ground for organizations to kind of move away and become fragmented, and to claim an identity which allied with their ethnicity rather than adhering to political blackness. And that then gave way in the 2000s to Muslim women, although there's no kind of corresponding category of Hindu women or Sikh women or whatever. There are obviously, but you don't hear about them as kind of a group of or a category of political activists and people with a political agency. So would South Asian be a better banner under which to organize in future? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know how things will evolve. But at the way that things are going right now, it doesn't seem to me. I think people will. There's a lack of resources. I mean, politics is about the sharing out of resources, isn't it? So there's a lack of resources, and I think that people tend to think that they will get something if they talk about either faith or ethnicity. rather than a label that is more encompassing of particular groups. But I don't know. I mean, I can't tell what will happen. I don't know if anyone else can. And then the Rushdie affair, you're right. The images are doing the talking. It was a whole very masculine kind of thing. And people talked about demonstrations that they went, because you had the Bradford 12 campaign, which was about the young men who, well, one of the things that had happened was the burning of books, of satanic verses, and then it's kind of spawned other kinds of incidents of violence and so on. And so, they were had up by the law, and there was a big campaign for justice for them, and all of those demonstrations, meetings, and they took place up and down across the country. They were very, very male dominated. There weren't women in those spaces at all. If there were very few. And it's not something that I actually picked on when we did interviews with women. So I don't know the reasons why women didn't feel, but in a way, it was something that was quite removed from their everyday life. They were involved in campaigns which were to do with immigration and their own status and their children's status, and so you can understand that. Whereas something to do with a guy who'd written a book who, which offended a lot of people, didn't resonate, maybe. I don't know. And then there was something else, but I can't remember what it was. Afghanistan. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, if you look back to the cover of Time magazine, it was at that time, it was full of images of Afghan women with burqas or burqas coming off or whatever, and it was used as, they were talking to an audience, a Western audience, that the reason why we're going in is because there's this noble cause, which is the cause of saving these women who are completely oppressed. And Laura Bush did this speech about a month after the invasion took place, talking about the moral rightness, the duty to go in and save these women. Tony Blair spoke about it. So, yeah, it was used. I don't think that, because prior to that, Afghan women didn't really figure. And as you say, after that, they haven't figured much either.
Turn the microphone on, that might help. I'm sure that a lot of people will have more questions for Khursheed, but I'm very conscious of the time and moving on for our final session. So I'm sure you'll be available afterwards for more questions, but I hope you will all join me in thanking Khursheed again for a really brilliant talk.